Hey guys, we are back updating the power rankings for the Amazing Race 36 following episode 2, and this was a bit of an interesting leg. Now, they did end up staying in the same spot as last time, where this leg took place immediately after the previous leg, but I still found it to be a lot of fun. There was obviously some pretty interesting stuff that happened here, but we'll get to that soon enough. But there are 12 teams to talk about, and let's waste any more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 12, we have the boots from this week, and here we have Chris and Mary. And I feel like this was largely to be expected, considering that they didn't do the best in leg 1, with them being 11th place in leg 1. And even before that, we saw Chris being pretty tired for a lot of it, to where that was obviously going to slow them down for a lot of it. And by the time of the end of the detour, it seemed like they were pretty doomed, considering that they had wasted a lot of time on the detour, switching from the color one to the balloon one, and they were pretty much in last place from the end of the detour on, and it didn't seem like they had much of a shot of catching up. And they do seem like a pretty likable team. You can very much tell that they like the show a lot and that they have a very strong relationship. I found them to be pretty likable there, but they are now out of the race to where they're here at number 12. And with that, there are 11 teams left in the race to talk about, and as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win the race based off their edit and current race position. By number 11, we have a team that did pretty poorly in leg 1, and they continue to do poorly here. And here we have Kishori and Karishma, and they got 10th place in leg 1, they got 10th place in leg 2. Now, along the way, there were some pretty interesting antics, like the fact that they went to the roadblock first, thinking that was the task, only for them to later realize their mistake and go back to the detour. But then even then, they go to the slower detour, the color one, until they end up switching that. So they end up wasting a lot of time over the course of the leg just trying to finish the detour. And they are in second to last for a decent chunk of the leg, only for them to pass Michelle and Shawn to snag a 10th place finish. So in a lot of ways, I'm not feeling that great about them from a race standpoint. I feel like they're definitely one of the bottom feeders here, and it wouldn't shock me if they're out relatively soon to where they're here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, we have another mostly mediocre team, and here we have Sunny and Busy. And they're another team that hasn't done that well across the leg so far, where they got 9th place in leg 1, they finished also in 9th place. And they were even in a spot to where they were 6th place coming into the detour, but they were the only team to complete the color detour, which was ultimately the slower detour, considering that a lot of the teams saw the balloons on the way to the clue box, so that caused them to pick the balloon detour, and that causes them to fall all the way to 9th place. And they were actually 10th place at the end of the roadblock, but they were able to catch up to 9th place due to other teams falling behind. So in a lot of ways, I find their race here to be pretty mediocre up to this point, and even their content about how they're moms and they want to prove that women can do anything isn't really much of a storyline I resonate with, especially considering how bad they're doing across the race, to where they're here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have a team that did all right in the first leg, but completely collapsed here, and here we have Michelle and Shawn. And at this point, I'm not feeling that great about them as racers, where even though they got a 5th place finish in leg 1, a lot of that was due to their race to the pit stop after the tasks, where they were actually around the 8th place spot for a lot of the leg 1. But in leg 2, they completely collapse here, where they get lost on the way to the detour. Kind of like Kishori and Karishma, they end up going to the roadblock first and doing that, only for them to realize their mistake. And even beyond that, they don't really do that well either, considering that the other teams pass them, and they get lost on the way to the pit stop as well, and they end up getting second to last there. So I'm not feeling that great about them as racers at this point. They're definitely a topsy-turvy team, and even their content isn't really enough to save them to where they're here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have a team that's kind of just mediocre at the race at this point, but we do have Anthony and Bailey. And they are one of the more consistent teams, technically, where they were 8th place at the end of leg 1, and they get 8th place after this leg. Though along the way, they do actually get a bit ahead, where despite them switching detours after getting to the color correction one, they actually managed to come out of the detour in 6th place, which I think is a sign of their good physicality, and they were actually 6th place coming out of the roadblock as well, but kind of like some other teams, they get lost on the way to the pit stop that causes them to fall to 8th place. So at this point, I'm not feeling the best about them. They are obviously in the back of the pack, and while I have some faith in them to grind out some tasks physically due to their physical prowess, I feel like there isn't really enough there for me to have them any higher than number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have a team that made a pretty strong comeback compared to their last leg, and here we have Amber and Vinnie, and they were obviously in a pretty bad spot after the last leg where they were last place coming into this leg, and obviously that was a pretty bad position. However, they actually managed to scrape on by where they are able to improve over the course of the leg, where they're 8th place coming out of the detour and they're 8th place coming out of the roadblock, and they were even able to catch up to where they get a 7th place finish by the end of it. We're considering that they were last place coming into it. The fact that they were able to make such a big improvement is a good sign for me. Now, obviously, there's a question of how consistent they'll do later on in the race, but I do feel like this was a positive sign for them. The fact that they have shown that they're able to come back from a pretty bad position, then also they seem to be pretty likable in the show. So I do feel alright about Amber and Vinnie at this point, but it's just a question of whether this trend will continue in the future and whether they'll continue to improve in the race. But for now, I do have them here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have a team that finished a spot above Amber and Vinnie, and here we have Angie and Danny. And I'm kind of conflicted over where to have Angie and Danny, considering that on paper, they seem to be a pretty high variance team. However, they managed to remain relatively consistent so far in the race to where they were 7th place after leg 1 and 6th place after leg 2. And this is despite them switching detours along the way, which I do find somewhat impressive. And I do feel like they're being propped up as one of the bigger characters on the show, particularly Danny, where we got a lot of content about him being a big super fan and how emotional he gets like whenever good things happen on the race. So I am kind of conflicted over where to have them at this point. I could see them having longevity due to them having big edits and due to Danny being the sympathetic figure. However, I don't feel like it'll lead to a win by the end of it. But still, they have been performing somewhat well across the race so far, to where I have them here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we have a team kind of similar to Angie and Danny, maybe not as emotional as those two, but still, they have been somewhat consistent, and here we have Yvonne and Melissa. Now, I do think this was a better episode for them where they got more to do in this episode, talking about how they like to trust but verify and how they're here to try to improve their relationship. And they do get another intro package as well, which is pretty good. But even beyond that, they have been pretty consistent on the race so far, where while they did come into the leg in 6th place, they were able to get to 5th place at the start of the detour, and they were able to hold that for the rest of the leg, which I do find somewhat impressive. They have been one of the more consistent teams on the race so far. And I feel like with their content, I feel like they'll probably do well across the season, but I feel like the top 4 teams kind of outclass them, both from an edit and race position standpoint, to where I have them here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we actually have the same top 4 as last week, which funnily enough was the same top 4 in leg 2 compared to leg 1, as these top 4 actually managed to remain in the same spot for pretty much the entire leg. So it's sort of funny how despite how topsy-turvy the bottom half of the pack was, the top half was relatively stable, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 4, we had the same people I had last week, and here we have Derek and Chalisa. Now, Derek and Chalisa did get 3rd place. They managed to hold that for the entire leg. And again, on paper, that's pretty good. But despite this, I don't feel like they're being propped up as much as they probably should have, where their content early on is about how Chalisa tends to get stubborn and how they loved her for that, and even beyond that, they get lost on the way to the clue box. So again, there is some questionable stuff there, and obviously even beyond that, despite them doing well on this leg, and really for the top 4 teams in general, there is this question over how consistent this will truly be, especially considering that there was no equalizers on this leg. But still, they were in the top 4. I feel like their results don't lie. But for now, I do have them here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we had the same team that I had at this spot last week, and here we have Juan and Shane. And again, they were in 4th place coming into the leg, they came in 4th place at the end of the leg, and there was no variation in between. And even beyond that, they got pretty decent content where they got another intro package talking about how they're like pilots and how they bonded a lot, and they seem to be pretty major characters on the season at this point. And I feel like with their results up to this point, I feel like they'll probably be in it for a decent amount. But again, I feel like compared to the top 2, I feel like the results aren't as good up to this point to where they're here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and it's obviously the same top 2 as last week. It's just a matter of ordering them. However, I did decide to change the order, believe it or not. But at number 2, I do have Rod and Letitia, who ended up winning this leg, getting their 2nd win of the season up to this point, which is pretty impressive. And I feel like that result alone is a big reason why I had them this high, considering that I feel like they've proven to be somewhat consistent, at least compared to the rest of the pack. And even beyond that, I feel like they haven't been undermined too much. Now, they did get content early on about how Rod doesn't seem to realize that Letitia's not an athlete and how he needs to like help her keep up. So again, I do question that to a degree, but beyond that, they have been pretty consistent racers up to this point, and that's a big reason I have them this high. But I do feel like the top team probably got a bit more propping up in their edit up to this point, despite them not winning the race. So because of that, I do have them here at number 2. And now at number 1, the team that I believe is the most likely to win the Amazing Race 36 at this point is Ricky and Cesar. And I wasn't entirely expecting them to be number 1 this week. Now, yes, they do get second place, where they were second place in leg 1, second place in leg 2, and they are able to hold that the entire leg. And again, I think on paper, I probably would have had them at number 2 because obviously they got outbeat by Rod and Letitia twice. However, I do feel like their content here was pretty solid, where early on they talk about how they wanted to win this leg, which was obviously something to look out for. They get another intro package talking about how they want to eventually move on to the next step and how they want to get to know each other better. And yes, while they do lose the leg, which kind of contradicts that, they do get to fight back to a degree where they get the confessional about how it's okay that they didn't win the leg, but they know that they have longevity on the season. And to me, that was enough to give them the edge over Rod and Letitia, as I feel like the show is going more out of its way to prop them up. That and also with them being pretty consistent racers and with them being at the top of the pack, I feel like they will be a pretty big force across the season, and I feel like that confessional at the end of the episode was just enough to give them the edge for me, which is why they're here at number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps out with the channel. Now I'll be back again next week to update the Power Rankings again, so you can look forward to that. I'm covering other shows right now, such as Survivor 46 and Big Brother Canada 12, so you can expect weekly Power Rankings of those shows. I'm on Patreon, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.